For my parents' 50th anniversary, I gifted them a $425,000 beachfront mansion. When I showed up, my mother was in tears and my father was trembling. My sister's family had moved in. Her husband stepped forward, pointed at the door and yelled, "This is my house. Leave." My sister laughed until I entered and silence fell. I bought my parents a seaside mansion worth about $1 million as a gift for their 50th wedding anniversary. And when I showed up, my mom was in tears and my dad was shaking because my sister's family had completely taken over the place. The moment I stepped inside, I learned her husband had just pointed at the door, told my dad this was his house now, and screamed for them to get out. And my sister had been laughing until she noticed me and the room went dead quiet. As I pulled into the curved driveway, a salty ocean breeze mixed with the smell of jasmine drifting through the open windows, and it felt like everything I'd worked toward had led to this single moment. I had spent 6 solid months dealing with planning, negotiations, and paperwork because my parents' 50th anniversary deserved more than a card and a dinner, and after 12 years of building my tech consulting company from scratch, I finally had the money to give them the retirement home they'd always talked about but never thought they'd have. I could still see my mom, Helen, standing on the beach during a family trip when I was 14, quietly pointing at the big beautiful homes along the shoreline and whispering someday, like she didn't really believe it would ever happen. My dad, Frank, had wrapped an arm around her back then and kissed her temple, and both of them knew that kind of life was way out of reach for a high school teacher and a nurse just trying to make ends meet. Somehow, though, I'd made that dream real, with a house sitting on 2 acres, its own path to the beach, wraparound porches, and huge floor-to-ceiling windows that filled every room with sunlight. The master bedroom opened onto a private balcony facing the Atlantic, and I even hired a designer to fill the place with soft blues and whites, cozy furniture, and a dream kitchen I knew would bring my mom to happy tears. So in my mind everything was perfect, or at least it was supposed to be. As I grabbed the anniversary banner from my trunk, my phone buzzed with a message from my dad that simply said there'd been a situation, and that my sister had arrived the day before, and the words sent a cold rush straight through me. My sister Jenna, who's 3 years older than me and has spent the last 10 years mastering entitlement and manipulation, hadn't spoken to me in 8 months, not since she called me selfish for refusing to pour money into her husband's 5th failed business idea. I hurried toward the front door, my shoes tapping sharply against the stone path, and through the big windows I could already see way too much movement inside the house. My parents were supposed to arrive alone that morning for a calm weekend before the big party the following week, so something was clearly wrong. The heavy oak door was cracked open, and when I pushed it wider, the sight inside made my blood run cold. My mom was collapsed on the sofa I'd carefully chosen, her face hidden in her hands as her shoulders shook with sobs, while my dad stood frozen in the middle of the great room, pale and trembling, looking like he'd aged a decade since Christmas. Jenna was stretched out in a leather chair by the fireplace with one leg crossed over the other, staring at her manicured nails like none of this concerned her, and her husband Kyle, a lifelong failure with an ego way bigger than his accomplishments, stood puffed up between my parents and the door like he owned the place. Their 3 kids, all between 6 and 12, were bouncing on the furniture with sticky hands, smearing the cream upholstery I'd spent weeks picking out, and a greasy half-eaten pizza was sitting right on top of the marble coffee table I'd had shipped in from Italy. Kyle announced loudly that this was his house now as he pointed toward the door and told my parents to get out, saying they'd already had their chance to live somewhere nice and now it was his family's turn. Jenna laughed and told him to stop being dramatic, adding that my parents could maybe visit on holidays if everything worked out. My dad tried to speak, his voice barely holding together, and said I'd bought the house for them as an anniversary gift and that the deed was in their name, but Kyle cut him off and said I could buy them something else more their speed, like a small apartment, because this house was exactly what he and Jenna needed for their kids. Right then their youngest, Lily, threw a juice box at the wall, splattering red liquid across the white paint, and Jenna lazily told her not to waste it while my mom cried harder and begged them to stop. Jenna finally snapped back that I had plenty of money and could just buy my parents something else, claiming they needed the house more and ranting about how hard Kyle had been trying with his businesses and how unfair it was that my parents would get something so nice when they were old anyway. Hearing her say that hit me like a punch even though I was still standing unnoticed near the entrance, and when Kyle stepped closer to my dad and told him one last time that this was his house and they weren't leaving, I saw my dad instinctively step back. Jenna stood up and smoothed out her expensive dress, the same one I'd seen her complain about online after maxing out another credit card, and calmly told my parents to accept it because she and Kyle had already moved in and the kids had picked their rooms. When my dad asked how she even knew about the house since it was supposed to be a surprise, she rolled her eyes and admitted my mom had mentioned I was buying shore property, then bragged about calling the realtor Paula, pretending to be me to get the address, driving down the day before, and deciding to stay as if all of this was perfectly normal. Kyle smirked and said home sweet home, while pulling out his phone, then warned that if my parents didn't leave within 5 minutes he'd call the police and claim they were trespassing, unstable and threatening his family, and my mom looked up at my dad with mascara running down her face and asked him what they were supposed to do. Watching my father's expression collapse nearly broke me, because this was the man who worked 2 jobs to put both his daughters through college, who never took more than a 3-day vacation, and who gave up everything he ever wanted so his family could have more, and in that moment something inside me snapped hard. I stepped fully into the room, my footsteps loud in the sudden quiet, and Jenna spun around so fast the color drained from her face while Kyle froze with his arm still pointed at the door, and even the kids stopped what they were doing, sensing the shift. I calmly said hello to Jenna and Kyle, my voice steady and sharp in a way I usually saved for boardrooms and negotiations, and told them I could see they'd gotten very comfortable in my parents' house. My mom jumped up from the couch, but I raised my hand and told everyone to stay exactly where they were, then pulled out my phone and showed them I'd been recording ever since I heard Kyle's threats from the hallway. I explained that what I just heard was incredibly helpful, since threatening to file a false police report is a crime, impersonating someone to obtain private property information is fraud and identity theft, and intimidating my father was another serious issue we needed to talk about. Jenna stammered that we were family and I wouldn't really do this, but I stepped farther into the room, forcing Kyle back without touching him, and told her very clearly that being related doesn't give her any legal right to occupy someone else's property. I started listing it out for them, breaking and entering, destruction of property as I pointed to the stained furniture and splattered walls, harassment, and threats against elderly people, which carries enhanced charges because of my parents' age. And when Kyle tried to puff up again and said I couldn't prove any of it, I calmly held up my phone. I told him I had clear audio of everything said in the last several minutes along with video footage from the security cameras installed throughout the house, then pointed out the discrete camera near the ceiling and explained it had been recording since the moment they broke in the day before, capturing every threat, every mess, and every second of them terrorizing my parents. The color drained from Kyle's face as I continued, my voice dropping into a dangerously calm tone, and explained that the deed was held in an irrevocable trust with my parents as the only beneficiaries and me as the trustee, meaning even if they wanted to give the house away, which they absolutely did not, they legally couldn't. I added that the trust specifically barred any transfer of the property to Jenna or Kyle by name, a clause I had my lawyers include because I know exactly who my sister is. Jenna's face flushed red as she started to curse at me, but I cut her off and walked over to the pizza box sitting on my coffee table, snapping photos while calmly explaining that the furniture damage totaled around $49,000, the stained table was $12,000, and the hand-mixed Venetian plaster her daughter redecorated would cost another $3,000 to repair, and that I was tallying damages in real time. My mom finally found her voice and asked how I even knew to come when I did, and I told her Dad's text felt wrong, too short, so I called the security company and asked for the live feed, then pulled my laptop from my bag and showed them the footage, admitting I watched everything from the parking lot because I wanted to hear exactly what they'd say when they thought they'd won. Jenna shot up from her chair and screamed that this was insane, and that I couldn't treat family like criminals, and I answered evenly that they were criminals who committed multiple crimes trying to steal a house that was never theirs and never would be. I asked Jenna what on earth made her think this would work, that I'd just shrug and buy our parents something else while she squatted in a house I paid for. And by then Kyle's aggression had completely collapsed as he muttered that maybe they got carried away and could just leave and pretend none of this happened. I smiled without any warmth and told him we were far past that point, then laid it out plainly that since he'd threatened a false police report, threatened my elderly father, and destroyed property, they had exactly 30 minutes to pack their things and get themselves and everything they brought out of the house. When Jenna asked what would happen if they didn't, her defiance finally cracking into panic, I told her I'd call the real police and press charges for every single documented offense, including trespassing, vandalism, harassment, elder intimidation, fraud, and identity theft, and that my lawyers would happily pursue both criminal charges and a civil suit that would bankrupt them for the rest of their lives. Jenna collapsed back into the chair, seething and desperate, and accused me of always having to win and never letting anything go, but I fired back that this had nothing to do with winning and everything to do with stopping her from victimizing our parents, because there's a massive difference between competition and cruelty. Kyle had gone completely pale by then as he frantically texted someone and muttered about staying with his brother for a while, and I told him dryly that was a good plan and that he should have thought about housing before giving notice on his rental to squat in a stolen house. When Jenna snapped her head up and demanded how I knew that, I simply told her I know her, and she wouldn't have been this bold unless she'd already burned every other bridge she had. You were counting on this actually working, I said as I walked over to the fireplace and slowly ran my finger along the mantel, already knowing the answer, then added that I'd bet this whole thing had been brewing for weeks, maybe months, ever since Mom accidentally mentioned I was buying property. The look on Chelsea's face told me everything I needed to know, because she'd clearly researched the area, looked up prices, and convinced herself she deserved this house more than our parents ever did. I said out loud what she didn't want to admit, that Derek probably fed into it by telling her her little sister shouldn't outdo her, that being born first somehow meant she was entitled to whatever I earned, and that sharing DNA didn't magically give her a claim on my life. Chelsea tried to interrupt, but I cut her off and told her I'd watched this same routine play out my entire adult life, starting with her complaining when I got my first promotion because she was older, accusing me of showing off when I bought my condo, and calling me lucky when I started my company as if hard work and preparation had nothing to do with it. I reminded her that those so-called connections came from networking events I dragged myself to after 12-hour workdays, and that my luck was really just risk-taking and relentless effort. Dad, who'd been quiet until then, finally spoke and said he needed to say something, turning to Chelsea and admitting she was right about one thing, that they'd enabled her behavior for far too long. He explained that every time she messed up, they stepped in to save her, every bad decision was cushioned, and instead of helping her grow, they taught her there were no consequences. When Chelsea tried to stop him, his voice steadied and he kept going, saying that when she dropped out of college to find herself, they paid her rent for 8 months, and when Derek's first business collapsed, they handed over $15,000 meant for a new roof and lived with leaks for years because of it. Mom quietly added that when Chelsea couldn't make her car payments, they co-signed a loan that wrecked their credit when she defaulted, and that they kept believing she'd eventually learn, even though she never did. Mom then pointed out that while all of that was happening, I put myself through graduate school, worked 3 jobs, built savings from nothing, and never asked them for help because I didn't need to. Chelsea exploded and claimed everything had always been easy for me. That school and money just landed in my lap, which made me laugh bitterly as I asked her if she had any idea what my life actually looked like while I was building my company. I told her about living in a tiny studio with thrift store furniture, surviving on ramen and eggs for 2 straight years while reinvesting every dollar, working 16-hour days without breaks, missing weddings and holidays, sacrificing relationships, and ending up with a stress ulcer before I turned 30. I stepped closer and told her nothing had ever been handed to me, that I clawed my way to every single thing I earned, and the worst part was that she was never happy for me, not even once. I reminded her how excited I was when I landed my first major client, the contract that saved my company, and how instead of celebrating, she said must be nice, before asking me for $5,000 for Derek's catering idea that barely lasted a month. When Derek tried to defend himself, I shut that down too, pointing out that the business failed because he never made a real plan, never researched the market, skipped permits, and canceled events whenever he felt like it. And when he said I didn't know what I was talking about, I reminded him that Chelsea had begged me to help clean up the mess and that I spent hours reviewing his numbers only to watch him ignore every piece of advice. Mom then stepped beside Dad and told Derek he'd been given chances most people only dream about, listing Chelsea's inheritance from her grandmother, the money my parents loaned him, the money I gave him, all of it wasted on ideas he abandoned the moment real effort was required. When Derek snapped that this was ridiculous and accused us of attacking them for trying to provide for their family, Dad raised his voice and asked how stealing from your in-laws and terrorizing people in their 70s counted as providing, or what kind of lesson it taught their kids. Chelsea shouted that they weren't stealing, just claiming what should have been partly theirs, arguing that I shouldn't be the only daughter allowed to do something nice for our parents, and I fired back that nothing was stopping her from doing something kind herself, like planning a gift, spending time, or showing up without asking for money, but that stealing my gift and calling it love was unacceptable. Chelsea jumped to her feet and shouted that I had no idea what it was like to struggle or worry about bills or feeding kids, And I calmly told her she was right because I'd never had children I couldn't afford, never quit jobs out of spite, and never spent money I didn't have on designer clothes and luxury cars to impress people I didn't even like. I told her those were her choices and choices come with consequences, and when she accused me of wanting her to suffer for making different decisions, I said no, I expected her to learn from them, get stable jobs, build a budget, and finally take responsibility for her own life. Live below what you earn until you actually earn enough to live comfortably, stop assuming other people should bankroll your choices, and start being the kind of parents who show responsibility instead of entitlement to your kids, because they're watching everything you do. At that moment, the middle child, Ben, peeked into the room and asked Mom and Dad if we were leaving, adding that he didn't want to go because the house was cool, and Chelsea's expression softened as she told him to head back to the car and promised they'd be there in a minute. Once he was gone, she turned to me with tears pouring down her face and said the kids were the reason they'd done this, that they deserved stability, a nice home, and not to feel like the poor kids at school. I told her more gently that if she really wanted stability for them, it had to be the real kind, the kind built on parents who show up consistently, pay their bills, and live with integrity, because a fancy house taken through theft isn't stability at all, it's a ticking time bomb. I asked her what she planned to tell them when I showed up and how she thought she'd explain why their grandparents weren't allowed in their own home, and she had no answer. Mom spoke softly then and said kids don't need a mansion. They need honest, present parents who teach them values, reminding us that some of her happiest memories were from our tiny 2-bedroom house, playing board games on the floor because we couldn't afford a proper table. Chelsea snapped back that it was easy to say now that they had all this, waving her hand around the room, and Dad answered firmly that they only had it because I worked myself into the ground to give it to them, and that they'd give it up instantly if it would teach her the value of earning instead of taking, though he knew it wouldn't. The silence that followed was thick with years of disappointment and failed attempts to help, and the kids sat huddled quietly on the couch, which made me soften my tone as I told them to wait in the car because this was an adult conversation, and they hurried out without a word. Chelsea broke down and begged me, saying they'd made a mistake and were just desperate, and I corrected her by pointing out it was Derek's 5th failed business, not a one-time setback, and that the real problem was their refusal to get stable jobs or accept that the world doesn't owe them anything. I reminded her how many times I'd stepped in, listing the $10,000 for the restaurant that shut down in 3 months, $15,000 for the consulting firm that never landed a single client, and $20,000 when she was unemployed for a full year, all of it never repaid. When Derek said they would have paid me back if things had gone differently, I cut him off and said the only way that would have happened is if I kept funding their fantasies forever, while I worked 80-hour weeks, gave up sleep, relationships, and my entire 20s to build my company, all while being called selfish for not bankrolling their lifestyle. I moved to the window and looked out at the ocean, thinking about how this view was supposed to bring my parents peace in their later years, then quietly said the real tragedy was that Chelsea had every advantage I did, the same parents, the same upbringing, and the same chance at a debt-free education because Dad worked overtime and Mom picked up extra shifts. Turning back to her, I told her the real difference between us wasn't luck or talent but discipline and gratitude, explaining how I saved 1/3 of every paycheck while she spent hers on shopping and concerts, how I invested raises into skills while she leased cars she couldn't afford. When she weakly said it wasn't that simple, I told her it really was, that success comes from thousands of small decisions stacking up over time, from waking up at 5 to work before my day job, spending weekends networking instead of partying, and constantly choosing long-term goals over short-term thrills. Derek scoffed and asked if that meant living like monks, and I explained there's a huge gap between enjoying life and living beyond your means, telling him I took vacations, bought a nice car, and upgraded my apartment only after I could truly afford those things and had earned them. Mom finally spoke again, her voice shaking as she asked Chelsea if she remembered wanting an expensive dollhouse at 8 years old and being told she'd have to save her allowance and do extra chores, and how she treasured it once she finally earned it. When Chelsea asked what that had to do with anything, Mom told her she'd once understood the value of working for what she wanted, but somewhere along the way she forgot and started expecting everything immediately, giving up whenever it didn't come easily. Chelsea cried quietly then and said she wasn't a bad person, just exhausted from struggling and feeling like a failure, and my anger softened into something closer to pity as I told her she wasn't failing because she lacked success but because she refused to change the habits keeping her stuck. I explained that every time she hit rock bottom, someone rescued her before she had to face the real issues, and that it stopped now. When she asked if I was abandoning her, I told her I wasn't abandoning her at all, I was just done enabling her, And if she wanted real help, I'd connect her with a financial counselor, help Derek build a real resume and practice interviews, and even watch the kids while they both worked honest, stable jobs. But I'm done handing you money unless you show real, lasting change, I said plainly. And when Derek's face flushed and he snapped that they didn't need my charity, I told him that was fine and that they could figure it out themselves, because those were the only two options left. I made it clear they could either accept structured help with conditions or solve their own problems, but what they would never do again was steal from my parents and expect me to pretend I didn't see it. I glanced at my watch, slipping back into a calm, businesslike tone, and told them they had 15 minutes left and would be smart to use them well. Mom had stopped crying and was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite place, while Dad looked completely drained as he sank into a chair. What finally cracked my voice, I admitted, was realizing they'd always treated our parents like something to be used, and I asked Chelsea where she was 3 years ago when Dad had his heart attack, reminding her that I was the one at the hospital managing doctors' paperwork and making sure Mom ate while she showed up once for 20 minutes and asked Dad for money while he was still in intensive care. Her face went pale as I kept going, saying that when Mom needed surgery last year, I rearranged 6 weeks of my life to help, while she sent a single card but somehow still had time to call me asking for money for Derek's next idea. When she whispered that we were still family, I told her family doesn't do what she did today, doesn't terrify their mother, threaten their father, or try to steal something that took years of sacrifice to give. I checked my watch again and told them they now had 26 minutes. Derek grabbed Chelsea's arm and told her they needed to go, and she panicked, asking where they were supposed to live since their lease was up and they'd already given notice. I told her calmly that they'd assumed they could steal a house I paid for, and that their bad planning wasn't my responsibility, because they were adults who needed to work, pay rent, and live within what they earned like everyone else. When she spat that it was easy for someone who had everything to say that, I corrected her and said I had what I worked for, explaining that every dollar I owned came from building something real, providing value, and managing money responsibly. I told them success wasn't luck, that when my business nearly failed early on, I didn't quit or beg for help. I worked brutal hours to fix what was broken, learned from mistakes, and kept going because success isn't owed to anyone, it's built. Derek started shoving bags together with tight, angry movements while Chelsea stood frozen, crying and accusing me of always being cruel and thinking I was better than them. I told her making money didn't make me better, but having character did, and that showing up for parents, honoring commitments, and not manipulating generosity were what defined a decent person. And what she did today showed exactly who she'd become. Mom finally spoke, steady and firm, and told Chelsea to leave, saying she'd done enough damage. And when Chelsea begged her, Mom's voice hardened in a way I'd rarely heard as she said she loved her but didn't like who she'd become and that she needed to go. That seemed to hit harder than anything else, because Chelsea grabbed a bag and stumbled toward the door as Derek called for the kids. Before leaving, Chelsea turned back and said not to expect them at the anniversary party, and Dad quietly answered that they weren't invited anymore. The door slammed, and through the window I watched them pile into their oversized SUV and peel out of the driveway, leaving the house silent behind them. Mom broke down then and hugged me tightly, apologizing and saying she never should have mentioned the house, and I told her it wasn't her fault and that Chelsea would have found out eventually. Dad joined us and explained how excited they'd been that morning, walking through the house planning where books would go and which room guests would use, until Chelsea arrived, seemed pleasant at first, then came back later with moving trucks and started claiming rooms while Derek grew aggressive and took their phones. Hearing the full story made my stomach turn, and I asked quietly if either of them had been hurt, and Dad said no, but admitted he'd never felt so powerless, being 70 years old and treated like an intruder in his own home. I guided them to the couch and asked if they wanted to press charges, explaining again that everything I'd said was true and that we had video evidence, and I'd support whatever they chose. After a long look between them, Mom said no, that she didn't want her daughter jailed but didn't want her in their lives either unless she truly changed, and Dad agreed that the footage was enough of a deterrent for now. I respected their choice and told them I was increasing security with more cameras, alarms, and automatic police calls if Chelsea or Derek ever returned. Mom thanked me and asked if the damage could be fixed, and I told her it was already handled, that restoration crews would take care of everything and the house would be perfect again within a week, just the way it was meant to be for them. Professional deep clean, Mom said softly, looking around, and added that I really had thought of everything, and I told her I'd tried as I sat down between them and took both their hands. I explained that I wanted this to be perfect, that I wanted them to walk into this house and feel like every sacrifice they ever made had meant something. Every time they went without so we could have what we needed, every extra shift, every coupon clipped, every dream put on hold. I told them this house was meant to be a message, a quiet but undeniable statement that their life's work mattered, and that they deserved beauty, comfort, and peace after all those years. Mom started crying again, but these tears were softer, full instead of broken, and she told me gently that it did say all of that, and that nothing Chelsea did could erase what I'd given them or how much it meant. Dad nodded, his voice steadier now, and said that when they arrived that morning before Chelsea showed up, they'd stood in the entryway and cried together, happy tears, walking through every room while Mom kept asking if it was real, if it was really theirs, marveling at the ocean view from the bedroom, the sunlight pouring through the windows, and the kitchen with the restaurant-grade stove she'd always dreamed about. And it still is ours, Mom said firmly, adding that Chelsea couldn't take that away, no matter how hard she tried, because I stopped her and protected them. We sat quietly for a while, the ocean breeze rolling in through the open windows, carrying with it the promise of slow mornings and peaceful dinners on the porch, and then I told them there was something important they needed to know. I explained carefully that the trust owning the house wasn't just about protecting it from Chelsea now, but also about the future, because many, many years from now when they were gone, the house would come back to me, set up that way so Chelsea could never challenge a will or try to claim it, and that this home would never belong to her. Dad squeezed my hand and said it was smart, even if it was painful, and then Mom surprised me by asking if they were terrible parents for raising a daughter capable of doing something like this. I told her immediately that they raised 2 daughters, that they loved us the same, gave us the same opportunities, taught us the same values, and that what we did with those lessons was our responsibility, not theirs, because Chelsea chose entitlement and I chose gratitude. Dad's eyes filled as he asked how I got so wise, and I smiled and told him I had excellent teachers, then told them exactly how the rest of the evening was going to go. I said we were ordering takeout from the seafood place in town with the crab cakes Mom loves, eating dinner on the back porch while watching the sunset, and tomorrow we'd make a list of repairs before shifting our focus back to the good, because next week was their 50th anniversary party with 40 of their closest friends, and this week was about celebrating 5 decades of marriage, not about Chelsea's failed attempt to steal a house. Mom smiled for real this time and said it sounded perfect, and as I placed the dinner order, I watched my parents walk hand in hand toward the porch, framed by golden evening light, still together and still strong after everything they'd been through. My phone buzzed with a message from Chelsea saying I destroyed the family and hoping I was happy, and I almost laughed, because I hadn't destroyed anything, I'd protected what mattered, so I deleted the message without responding. An hour later we were cracking crab legs, dipping them in butter, and slowly letting the weight of the day loosen its grip, while Dad told the story of how he proposed to Mom. A story I'd heard 100 times but never got tired of, and Mom laughed in all the same places with the same warmth I imagined she had 50 years ago. I raised my glass and toasted to 50 years and many more in this beautiful home, and Dad raised his to me, saying I'd given them more than a house, while Mom quietly added that I'd given them dignity, peace, and protection from people who should have cared for them. We clinked glasses as the sky faded into pinks and oranges, and later, after they went to bed in their new master suite, I sat alone on the porch listening to the waves, my laptop open as I reviewed the security footage one last time to make sure everything was backed up and documented. Chelsea's face at the moment she realized she'd been caught stuck with me, not just the shock, but the brief flicker of understanding that she'd gone too far and crossed a line she couldn't undo. Part of me mourned the sister I used to have, the one who braided my hair, helped me study, and stood up for me when we were kids, but that version of Chelsea had slowly disappeared, replaced by someone who measured relationships by what she could take. I knew I couldn't fix her, but I could protect my parents and make sure the rest of their lives were calm and secure, and that this house would stand as proof of their love, their sacrifices, and the power of building something honestly. My phone buzzed again, this time from Derek, saying they were at a motel and the kids were asking why they had to leave the pretty house, hoping I could live with myself, and the manipulation was so obvious it barely registered, so I blocked both of their numbers and added them to the security system's exclusion list. Tomorrow I'd meet with my lawyers to formalize everything, update my parents' estate plan, and hire the restoration team to erase the physical damage, knowing the emotional wounds would take longer but would heal. The anniversary party would go on, friends would gather, stories would be told, Chelsea's absence would be noted and whispered about. But the celebration would continue, Because resilience isn't about avoiding pain, it's about refusing to let it define you. I texted my parents, knowing they were probably still awake, telling them I loved them more than words could say and to sleep well in their forever home. And Mom replied right away that they loved me more and thanked me for being their daughter, followed by Dad saying proud didn't even begin to cover it. I closed my laptop and looked out at the dark ocean, moonlight dancing across the waves, the house behind me solid and safe, filled with the people who mattered, and I knew Chelsea had tried to steal this moment and failed. Tomorrow morning my parents would wake up in their dream home, make coffee in their beautiful kitchen, and walk out onto their private beach to watch the sun rise over the Atlantic, exactly the way it was always meant to be.